right, so huge thank you to the Center for New American Security for hosting this, and thank you to Paul for the very, very easy assignment, how to talk about all regulations for AI in all sectors in 10 minutes. We're good? We're good? We're going to do it? All right. So that's impossible, obviously. What I can do is I can describe some of law's reactions, some of the way law deals with different kinds of legal disruptions and their respective benefits and their respective drawbacks, when they're going to work, when they're not. And at the outset, it's important to start by recognizing that law is a tool for regulating human behavior, for trying to change human conduct in different ways. And any significant change in what human conduct is possible, say a political revolution or an economic shift, is going to change the law, is going to cause legal disruption and evolution. I study the interaction between law and new technology because this is a space where there tends to be dramatic shifts in what is possible for human beings to do in short time periods and in entirely unanticipated ways. So it's a fascinating area of legal disruption. And law has three major ways of responding to these disruptions. At one end of the spectrum, one of the most extreme responses is to ban it. If we don't have the new technology, we don't have to deal with the new conduct that it enables. And this is a very popular, sometimes knee-jerk response when there's a new technology that has different muddy ethical issues associated with it, when it's a new technology that has dangers that are not well understood. And there are a lot of benefits to bans, right? Not all innovation is necessarily good, and there's a lot of benefit to having some breathing space to step back and pause and think and better understand a new technology before releasing it into the wild. The issue with bans is that they're not always going to be effective. And I've done some pretty extensive studies of the history of weapon bans, trying to figure out what makes a ban more or less likely to be effective. And I found that effective bans, successful bans, are correlated with two major factors. One is the architecture of the technology that's being regulated, and whether or not there is some bottleneck that can be controlled, say the materials necessary or the expertise necessary for creating or acquiring that technology, and also whether or not the architecture of the technology allows for violations to be identified. One of the other aspects that's really determinative of whether or not a ban is going to be successful is what conduct that new technology enables. So certain conduct, certain technologies simply allow human beings to do something, to accomplish an aim more effectively than anything else. And in certain circumstances, that kind of conduct and the technology that enables it is going to be very, very difficult to ban. There is a drawback. There are a couple drawbacks with bans. One is that it's a very broad regulatory approach, and it risks taking off the table potentially beneficial new technology. So I don't think anybody in this room thinks it's going to be possible to ban AI generally, and it's not even clear that we'd want to. There's so many potential benefits associated with it. But there is a question and an ongoing debate about whether or not it's going to be possible, or we should ban certain applications, certain kinds of artificial intelligence, particularly in warfighting. Okay, so in bans. Bans one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the opposite legal approach, which is doing nothing, waiting and seeing. Stepping back, trying to understand the technology that you might consider regulating at a later date, letting the market work it out, seeing what happens when there's a problem, using law by analogy to try and address it. There are benefits associated with this too, right? It promotes innovation, avoids overbroad regulation. There's also huge drawbacks. One thing that I like to remind industry actors is there's no such thing as no regulation. There's early regulation and there's late regulation, but believe me, regulation happens, right? And late regulation sometimes counterintuitively can be far more strict than early regulation. So take the Tesla example that we talked about earlier, right? Sometimes when you have an accident involving a new technology that's particularly dramatic, you're going to get responsive lawmaking that's overbroad and strict. in response to that accident in a way that might not have happened if you had ex-ante lawmaking or rulemaking imposing safety standards that would have prevented that accident or determined liability in response to that accident. Other issues with taking the wait-and-see approach is that it really risks difficult to remedy damage or sometimes impossible to remedy damage. We basically took a wait-and-see approach towards much of the last industrial revolution that resulted in a huge amount of worker injury, as well as a huge amount of pollution that to this day is very difficult to address. So one question worth asking is, what will be the negative side effects of an AI industrial revolution? Who is going to be harmed? What is the resource that we currently think of as inexhaustible that is actually exhaustible? Okay, so on one side, ban. On the other side, take a wait-and-see approach. Somewhere in the middle is a Goldilocks solution. The idea of proactively creating new law to try and address specific problems. And this kind of this could take a couple different forms. Direct regulation happens on a spectrum of tech-neutral lawmaking and tech-specific lawmaking. Tech-specific lawmaking is usually done to address a specific problem associated with a specific technology. So you can imagine maybe a law that sentencing algorithms need to be interpretable and explainable so that individuals can challenge them and have a basis for challenging them. Direct laws can also be more tech-neutral to preserve an overarching goal or an overarching principle. So you can imagine a requirement that machine learning training sets don't have bias. Good luck with that, but you can imagine something tech-neutral, a tech-neutral law like that. There's going to be trade-offs on this tech-neutral, tech-specific spectrum. The more tech-neutral a law is, the more future-proof it is, right? The more it's going to apply to different kinds of new technologies as they arise in advance. And it's going to protect certain norms ahead of time. This happens a lot with customary international humanitarian law. The problem is, the trade-off is, with flexibility comes interpretability and changeability. And so one aspect of tech-neutral law is it actually puts the power of enforcement of that law in the hands of the interpreters, the later date interpreters. So it's going to be the judges or the states interpreting the law that are going to actually determine what it is. When you have a tech-specific law, it keeps the power in the hands of the rule maker, right? The legislator or the agency, and possibly even the industry, if it's the industry is the one making the rule. So trade-offs between tech-neutral and tech-specific. One thing that's not always recognized is how law can operate indirectly to regulate. And it can do this through creating benefits, creating incentives, creating punishments that affect different regulatory forces. So one example is you can use law to foster the development of new norms. You can require industries to create codes of conduct and publish them and then hold them accountable to those codes of conduct. You can use law to require specific technical design features in a new technology. For example, require any AI system to meet certain safety standards before its release or its marketing. You can also, this is a popular one, you can use law to influence the market, to create market-based means of changing incentives. You can have tax incentives and tax breaks for research in certain areas, provide grants for certain kinds of research, or on the back end impose fines for certain kinds of problems, certain violations. So you use law to change the market to influence different actors. So as you might have gathered through my tone, I believe in the power of proactive lawmaking. I have to acknowledge there are some drawbacks to this Goldilocks approach as well. First, obviously, it's not possible to anticipate all the problems ahead of time. And when you're trying to imagine and focus on one, you risk wasting resources on an issue that might never actually arise. This happened with the international community. It spent a lot of time on cloud seeding and weather modification treaties and anticipating a kind of technology that never really manifested. And while you're focusing on these problems, or trying to get energy, trying to get excitement about a problem that hasn't happened yet is very difficult. So it's just simply hard to enact proactive regulations because there's not a lot of momentum behind it when you don't have the concrete accident that you are responding to. But there's obviously a huge amount of benefits to this kind of regulation. It really allows for one to use the law to channel the development of technology in socially beneficial ways and proactive ways to preserve certain principles or protect vulnerable populations. So the main takeaway I'd like to leave you with is that law is a tool made by humans to guide human conduct. Like any tool, it can be well or poorly made, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad purposes. But it's not handed down on high. It evolves, it changes, and what laws you want to have are going to depend on the architecture of the technology you want to regulate and the specific problems you'd like to address. So, thank you.
Hello, I'm Jack with OpenAI, and I believe some slides are going to materialize shortly. There they are. So I'm here to talk about a couple of issues which sort of relate actually to the previous talk, and one is dual use, and how the lack of a sort of notion of dual use in the AI community as it stands today is exactly the sort of thing which will lead to the late stage regulation which we kind of want to avoid because it will have a bad effect. And I want to talk about measurement, which is a thing that we as a community are starting to do, but part of the reason I'm here is I think it's a thing that many people need to be involved in, which will allow us to do the sort of better thing, which is earlier regulation that's sort of governed and predicated on knowledge about where the technology is going. So, I mean, let's start with dual use, and let's talk about the kind of basic machine learning technologies we have today. So, on the left there on that slide is a synthetic face generated from a paper in 2014, or an array of them. These are quite obviously not real. The ones on the right are also synthetic faces, which came out last week. This was a paper by NVIDIA. It's a good paper. I advise any of you who really like AI to go and read it because it has some interesting ideas in it. And it was released along with the code. Do I think this is dangerous? Not quite yet, but I think that it gives you a flavor of this rate of progression of this technology and the way in which change can come from sort of surprising areas. And as a community currently, the default setting is to publish everything. And I don't think this is necessarily the right thing to do in the long run, nor do I think it's the thing which will lead to a sort of happy and relaxing world for all of us. I prefer to be relaxed. So I'll show you where we're currently thinking the areas of notions of dual use need to enter. And here you have examples of reinforcement learning. We've spoken about them earlier. Again, on the left, you have Atari. This is work by DeepMind in sort of 2013 and 14. They show that you can beat Atari games with reinforcement learning. In 2015, they have the first AlphaGo result. And then in 2017, we had this result on Dota, which is a sort of partially observable game. Similarly, other people are working on games like, StarCraft, and there's broad interest in taking actions in very, very complex environments. Now, I'd sort of challenge you to think of what another 2 or 3 years of progress looks like in terms of these algorithms, and what happens to us if we don't develop a notion of dual use as a community, and if we were to willingly sort of publish everything. I'd note that for the latter two, AlphaGo and Dota, not all of the details have been published yet, and I doubt that they, in the fullness of time, will be, and that may provide a kind of template for how we think about dual use going forward. So what I'd sort of challenge you to think about is how we should work out what technologies we need to think about as being dangerous to publish or not. And I want to motivate you by showing you a selection of papers which I picked up over the last week or 2 weeks from just the public internet. You'll see papers on vehicle identification from aerial imagery. You'll see papers on pedestrian identification and re-identification. Many of these papers come along with techniques to implement them and code. They're published by a variety of actors ranging from universities to government-linked research labs. I believe one of these is a US Army research paper, and also papers from other actors in other geographies. Now, the fact that this is happening now, I think, is broadly benign, but I don't think it's going to be benign for long. And so I've been thinking about possible solutions to this, and ways in which we can avoid 2 more years of progress leading to papers being published that could lead to credible harm happening, which would obviously lead to regulation, which would happen rapidly, and regulation which we may not sort of ultimately want to occur. So the big idea I've got is that we, not just AI people, but the national security community and other parts of the government need to indulge in measurement. And I'm going to show you why this will be extremely painful and difficult now. Here is a selection of graphs about AI where we have done measurement. This is not useful at all. And the reason why I've put all of this together for you is to show you that reasoning about AI is difficult. Measuring different aspects of it and different slices of it doesn't really give you the kind of holistic view that you'd need to create regulations. And the reason why this is the sort of best thing I can do now is that these are the sorts of measurements being conducted by individual communities of individual scientists, usually without any kind of dialogue with policymakers about what they'd like to see measured, nor with any kind of push from the government side on raising conversations about what they think should and shouldn't be sort of something that we consider. And I'd sort of ask you to think about what the coming generation of AI looks like and what we should do to measure it. You saw these reinforcement learning systems which can take actions. In about a year or two, it's going to be possible to train drones in simulators and explore transfer learning technologies and transfer them into the real world to do things. You saw previously a paper on reinforcement learning for quadcopter landing. That's clearly something that people in this community in particular would like to get a read on ahead of time. And it's not going to come solely from the scientific community that sort of produces these papers. It's going to come from a big collaboration. And so what this collaboration might look like would be, in my mind, a wonderful community of not only scientists, but also people from across the agencies and government actually collaboratively measuring this, so that rather than perceiving the kind of individual slices of the subject area, you end up thinking about the actual whole. This won't be remotely easy. It's actually going to challenge a lot of our notions about how scientists should and shouldn't operate, what we should and shouldn't publish, but also where government's place is to mandate what sort of should and shouldn't be being explored. Because the tendency is going to be towards being open. You don't want to kind of restrict the size or quantity of eggs that the kind of golden goose can lay. So obviously you don't want to do premature regulation to damage the sort of position of leadership the US has attained in AI. But you do definitely want to know the shape of the sorts of systems which are emerging. And I realize that this is kind of an elephant here. I think that the sorts of systems we're going to produce are going to be of such power and magnitude that we need to develop new ways to think about measuring their impact. It won't be just a single readout on, the ability of a quadcopter to transfer to the real world. It'll be a readout on its ability to transfer to the real world, and take, orders and the amount of compute it costs to train it, the amount of power it costs to train it. We need to generate the necessary telemetry so that good regulations can be made, because otherwise at some point something sort of negative will occur, and then we'll make regulations in the absence of any true data. Another example I'd give you here is we've talked about automation a lot today, and we've talked about the issues of how automation may affect the workforce. It may not surprise some of you to know that if you look at the annual survey of manufacturers, which goes out to American manufacturers, we aren't asking them what level of automation is present in the robots you're buying for your factories. We aren't asking them the necessary information that we could do to give us the data we need as a community of people who want this to benefit America for a good outcome to occur. And so instead we have these sort of directionless conversations about its effect on employment, its effect on state actors, its effect even in cybersecurity, where we're doing good work via stuff like DARPA, but there needs to be more. And what I'd like to see is for this debate to sort of grow and become more public, because I think that can lead to more excitement among the public about also the possibilities of this. If we had more proactive measurement of exactly how AI can benefit things like medical diagnosis, I think there'd be less wariness on the part of people about it making its way into society, because you'd learn of just how it can benefit you, as well as how it poses certain unique challenges which we need to be aware of. And so, in closing, what I'd like us to think about is sort of what do governments want to measure in this area? without that dialogue, it's very difficult for us as a scientific community to know what our norms should be. We're going to try and define them among ourselves, but without more of a public conversation and dialogue, stuff will sort of invariably go wrong, which we obviously want to avoid. We also want to make sure that we can do this kind of top-level analysis of where progress isn't happening to guide eventual policy or eventual possible investments on the part of governments or, the private sector into certain high-value research areas. We've talked a lot about China today. China does do aspects of this already. It does do reasonable amounts of measurement, and some of its national plan was informed by what I'd describe as a kind of greater gut-level intuition about AI's progress at the government level. And I think that for people in China, that's probably seen as, a good thing. They have a more coherent strategy as a consequence. And I think that we can do the same thing, and it actually doesn't take much. It just takes a few steps in this direction. So sort of in closing, we are going to think about dual use. Publication and the nature of open publication will sort of change over time, but that has to happen in the form of a two-way conversation here so that we avoid surprise and so we can be proactive. So thank you very much. Where are you sitting? But I think you're on the far side as the moderator.
Hi, everybody. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? My name is Phil Stewart. I'm the Military Affairs and Intelligence Correspondent at Reuters. In addition to Jack and Rebecca, I'd like to introduce Kirsten Vinyard, who is the Deputy Director at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and has been deeply involved in international discussions on AI and on cyber. And also, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lynn Parker, who is an AI researcher at the University of Tennessee and helped lead the development of the Obama administration's National AI R&D Strategic Plan. So actually, I'd like to start off by referencing the first panel we had this morning with Eric Schmidt, where he spoke kind of alarmingly about how the United States could lose its competitive advantage when it comes to AI, that China was on track to challenge the U.S. dominance. And I wanted to ask Lynn, if you could just, from your position, having seen the U.S. government's approach to this, is Congress, is the White House, is this administration or the last prioritizing AI the way it needs to be prioritized?
So first, I'm speaking for myself. The answer is no. Would you like me to elaborate? Yes. No, I don't think we have a sense of urgency. I think there are reasons for that lack of urgency. Certainly, if you look historically, say the last 50 years or so, we have had the great pleasure of living in a country where many of the technological advances are coming from this country. We have invested in research and development for 50 years or more, and we have benefited from the investments in research and development. Now we have very strong economic high-tech companies that are benefiting from decades of investment in basic research. I think we've forgotten that. I think we've forgotten our history. We've forgotten that where we are today as the world leaders in economic development and other areas is because we have been investing in R&D for years and years. And since we're at, we're talking about America, and if we agree that we want America to be the best in the world in these areas, I think what it takes is a recognition that we got here on the shoulders of many people who worked very hard and who recognize that it's the research and the advancements in science and technology and engineering that give us all of these great benefits. And so the question is, why is that today that we've lost our sense of urgency? So I'm a computer scientist and an engineer, and I would argue that I think as a culture, we've lost our value in recognizing the importance of science and technology and engineering. I think about my dad's generation. My dad was an engineer, and most of his friends were engineers, and I don't think it was just because they were engineers that they were friends. I think it used to be that many people studied engineering and science as a matter of their course of living. I think I'm correct to say that most of the Politburo in China they are composed of scientists and engineers. So it's not surprising that they recognize the importance of science and technology, including AI, because they are scientists and engineers by and large, plus economists and so forth. And so I think we as a nation, in some sense, don't understand the technology. And I think that has led to some of these fears that you see in the media and in movies and so forth, is really a fear that these technologies are going to do something that they aren't going to do. And maybe if we understood them better, we wouldn't be quite so afraid. So I think there are a lot of different reasons as to why we're at the situation where we don't really have a sense of urgency. But I do think in looking historically at how we got to where we are today, to me, it's investments in the R&D that have led to the position that we're in. And I think because the technologies today, particularly for AI and the charts, the examples that Jack just showed and others earlier today showed about how quickly this technology is advancing, that I think we're going to be surprised. And recognizing that today's technology is not the same as what the engineering advances were in the past, that perhaps took a little bit longer. So in summary, I think we don't have that sense of urgency, largely because I think as a nation we don't really understand collectively what this means.
And Jack, you spoke about how in your gut you thought that China understood this. What do you think the implications are if the U.S. isn't prioritizing this? China in its gut does kind of have a sense of its importance. What are the implications of that? And then also, what does the U.S. government, what role should the U.S. government have, and maybe shouldn't have, in prioritizing investment in this area?
So 2 things. One, in the case of what happens to China, I think a number of good things are going to happen to China. You're going to see cheaper medical technology, you're going to see better healthcare mediated via AI systems, and you're obviously going to see a number of applications in the kind of security domain. It's going to change the character of the nation to see the benefits accrue to its citizens as well as the private sector and the government. And I think that will have a compounding effect on how it invests in it. That's something which I think we are underestimating. And it's sort of what Lynn referred to. Don't underestimate the sense of the power that a sense of possibility can create in other people. And that's what this technology does. What the government sort of should do, the reason why I talk about measurement is why don't we care about it? I think it's because there are all of these, we're in a plane and most of the dials are completely missing. We have no idea how fast the plane is going, the trajectory it's on, and our legislators will see occasional examples like AlphaGo and like other things, and they'll find that exciting for a moment, but they're not going to be hit with a steady drumbeat of this happened this week, this happened this week. If you tracked the progress of drone automation technology just over the public papers that have come out in the last 2 years, you would find it, exciting and hair-raising in equal measure. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get the sense on the government side that this is a matter of urgency. I don't think government should yet regulate on things like, bans of technologies or theorize about far future technologies. Some people have spoken about superintelligence. I think that would be premature. But I think government should at least be tracking what the technology can and can't do, because otherwise also a more pernicious effect is the people that track it will be outside of government, and as AI becomes more and more important, those people will have motivations about how they present the data. And it's very dangerous if the government is solely informed by people outside of itself, because then it's not going to get things which are also germane to its own interests.
Well, Kirsten, on that point, right now, governments around the world are, with varying degrees of information, are engaged in this discussion about what to do about AI. And you're going to be in a meeting in a couple of weeks, I think, that's going to look at this issue head on. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that meeting. And before you do, I wanted to read, there was an open letter signed by various people. One of them was Elon Musk. I'm just going to read one clause in this letter. It said, lethal autonomous weapons threaten to become the third revolution in warfare. Once developed, they will permit armed conflict to be fought at a scale greater than ever and at time scales faster than humans can comprehend. These are weapons of terror, weapons that despots and terrorists can use against innocent populations, and weapons hacked to behave in undesirable ways. We do not have long to act, etc. So could you talk a little bit about what this meeting will be? This was an open letter to inform that meeting. There was also a food for thought paper. Give us a sense of what's going to happen there and what should our expectations be.
All right. Well, the meeting, of course, you're referring to is the meeting of the group of governmental experts that was founded or established by the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, who have been discussing lethal autonomous weapon systems in informal meetings of experts since 2014. And so they've been meeting 1 week a year since 2014 to discuss developments in autonomy and weapon systems. So spoiler alert, autonomous weapon systems will not be banned 2 weeks from now in Geneva. So I hate to break it to you, but that's the case. There's a lot of expectations, though, for this meeting. And a lot of states expected and have been preparing for, based on the mandate for this group of governmental experts, that they would be discussing definitions, because that's one of the issues right now. We have a lot of policy responses on the table. There should be a ban. There should be a moratorium. We should do nothing. We should wait and see. But there's a lot of what are we talking about conversation still needs to happen. And some states believe that the best way to do that would be first to come up with a definition. Right? So states have been preparing for that. There's also a sense of urgency, as evidenced by the open letter. And there's some frustration because there were supposed to be 2 weeks of meetings this year. And for financial reasons, due to the state of the treaty and the contributions to the treaty, have reduced that to a 5-day meeting. So the chairman of the meeting, which is Ambassador Amandeep Gill of India, put out his food for thought paper, which is something that chairmen and chairwomen often do in preparation for the meeting. And that paper has raised a lot of questions. In fact, it's 3 pages of questions, and it's 3 pages of questions on AI. And that has shaken some expectations about the meeting, in the sense that he wanted to focus on a thorough review of the current state of developments in the technology domain and their instantiation, I can't even say that word, in military systems, right? This food for thought paper has generated a lot of talk. It's generated some criticism publicly by groups like the Campaign to Ban Killer Robots. Obviously, they have a strong policy position. There's been some questions from states as well about if this is useful. Essentially, there's 2 criticisms: that the paper is too narrow. It's left out many of the issues that have been central to the discussions up until now, which include human rights issues of proliferation, issues of human control, which has been a big theme for the last 3 years, about meaningful human control, appropriate levels of human judgment, depending on what community and practice you come from. And those things are absent from the food for thought paper. Other people say it's too broad, that we've gone way meta-level on AGI-related issues, and rather than sticking to perhaps the more narrow, nearer-term applications of AI in weapon systems. So it's not real sure what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time, so watch this space.
Well, Rebecca, I mean, if just going to you, I mean, could you, as someone who looks at the legal aspects, international legal aspects of autonomous weapons and the discussions that are happening in Geneva and elsewhere, I mean, is there any kind of legal consensus in any aspect of this? Is there anything that could help guide these discussions as they stand right now? Because it seems to me, based on discussions we've heard here today, there's a lot of debate of whether there's even going to be or there is an arms race that's going to happen. We heard this morning there wouldn't be, or there isn't anytime soon. But later in the day, we heard there might be. Where are we right now?
So I would say there's a huge risk that the discussion of regulation of autonomous weapon systems is going to focus on autonomous weapon systems with, as the UK defines it, human cognitive level of judgment, of some futuristic weapon system that may actually be banned because it's defined out of existence, right? Or we might there might be a ban of a weapon system that nobody actually wants to develop. And I'm really concerned that a lot of energy in this space is getting poured into narrowing in on exactly what should be banned at the expense of talking about what should be regulated and what are the issues we're concerned about right now. What humanitarian protections are being undermined by weapon systems that exist right now, that are being deployed right now with increasing levels of autonomy and autonomous capabilities. What military systems could be made better by different weapon systems with increasing autonomous capabilities. And so I'm concerned that as a legal matter, the focus on the ban is the solution to one specific problem that's not, it's sucking all the oxygen out of the room for talking about other problems raised by autonomous weapon systems, or depending on how you define them, weapons systems with varying levels of autonomy.
And just on the legal aspects, I mean, is there, when it comes to accountability, how does current law, you look at U.S. law on weapons manufacturers, how might that inform how policymakers look at the issue of autonomous weapons?
So domestically, there's a lot of tort law and also tort exceptions for weapons manufacturers. At the international level, there's not a lot of accountability for accidents that occur in war, at least attributed to states. And I was thinking about this a lot with the prior panel. We were talking about human-machine interaction. The more you have automated systems and systems with high levels of autonomy on the battlefield or engaged in decision-making trees, the more you're going to have accidents that arise as a result of problematic human-machine interactions. You're going to have skill fade, right? You're going to have situations where humans are not able to judge when best to jump in, and this is going to result in accidents in wartime, which tend to be fatal. And when that happens, the existing system of accountability in international law is primarily international criminal law, holding individuals accountable for willfully committing war crimes or recklessly committing war crimes. There's not any real individual accountability for negligence, at least in criminal law. I think that's a good thing. I think negligence is not it tends to be a balancing standard. That's not something you want to introduce into criminal law. And so I've made the argument that we should have something called war torts, where states are held strictly liable for accidents that occur in war, particularly in result of the use of autonomous weapon systems, as a way of limiting the use of them, recognizing their utility. Just like in domestic law, we recognize that many ultra-hazardous activities have benefits. Dynamite has beneficial uses in construction. But there are certain accidents that no matter what you do, no matter what precautions you take, you can't protect against. And in those cases, the victims deserve compensation, and there needs to be some limiting factor on how often that kind of technology is used.
A couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. Jack, you were talking before in your presentation, you used one word that kind of struck me, which was governments. Mm-hmm. You're looking at governments. And so a lot of people here, within an eye shot of Congress are thinking about this government, but you're looking at it more globally and regulations that could be imposed on industry. And what I'm wondering is, given the very different take that countries like China impose on the different kind of regulations that countries like China impose on industry, how do you think industry is going to navigate this? I mean, the U.S. is obviously very concerned about losing its dominance, while China is able to kind of extract quite a lot of information from companies that operate there. How do you think industry is going to navigate this space in the coming years?
And by navigate, what do you mean precisely?
Well, to navigate the different patchwork of regulations, that arise. Is it going to be a battle in each corner, or? I
mean, I think some of it really is a definitional thing, and we heard about the meeting which is happening at the UN, and how some of that letter is a series of questions about the technology, because there is a lack of information about the technology and a lack of shared understanding in governments, plural, around how it works. So I think on one level, you want to have governments who are sort of communally measuring different aspects and communicating that to each other, so you have a shared discourse. As to how you navigate regulations, I think that it will depend very much on the culture that implements the AI system. You can imagine that in the US, there will be regulations around things like bias. These regulations may not exist in other countries. I don't have a solid answer for you, because I think at the moment we're going to deal with a series of definitional problems so large that it will be difficult to even sell in countries which are that different sort of in their economic structure to your own.
Mm-hmm. Have you followed at all these conversations that are going on in Washington about CFIUS, whether CFIUS might need to be reformed in order to keep AI in the United States? What are your thoughts on that?
It risks mistaking it risks there's a risk here which is inherent to the generality of the technology. And I'll give you a kind of motivating example. If I have a video analytics company that does personalized analytics for footage that people take on their consumer drones so that I can automatically identify my family members from overhead, and so that I can kind of page through my memories and be like, there's me and my mum and Spot the dog, that's nice. This technology is a general purpose and a dual use technology, and if that company were to receive a large scale investment by another entity, perhaps a Chinese entity who also wanted board control, and then that technology was to be changed or adapted to something which would have a NatSec purpose, that seems like it would currently fall under the scope of what's being considered. I think that is very dangerous and very chilling, because it means that you have a general class of technology which is now being regulated against a specific foreign actor's possible sort of interference, and that feels so broad to me that it will cause problems in terms of economic competitiveness that will outweigh the sort of benefits you might get from such a broad piece of legislation. So again, I mean, this is where I think it comes down to definitional questions. I think the lack of an understanding of exactly what this technology does and what its capabilities are is leading us into a path of very general regulations motivated out of, to some extent, a sense of fear, and also a sense that we haven't got a handle on the progress in our own country.
Well, fascinating discussion. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. We've got a great panel, so I'll get as much time in as I can. Yep, over here.
Hi, this question is for all the panelists, but maybe especially for Jack as someone who's close to the AI research itself. Is how should governments, regulators, multilateral bodies go about interacting with AI researchers themselves as they're developing these policies? I think I've heard some hesitation from AI researchers in, for example, some of the European regulations that are coming through, and how sort of applicable and actionable those will be. So I'd be curious for your thoughts.
I mean, I'd like to get lists of what people are worried about earlier. I have had discussions with people where they say, here are issues we are concerned about. It is like very, very, we're many periods of time away from doing any actions on it, but we're currently trying to figure it out. And then that seems like an easy conversation to actually bring the technology community into, because it doesn't have this implication that you're then going to do something, which is where you can have these issues of ideological differences among the engineers and researchers that work on this technology. So I'd say sort of talk early and talk often, and also try and talk a bit more openly so that you don't treat these participants as like a black box, which is how people sort of view government sometimes.
So I would just throw in on that, on the Musk letter that you mentioned, was really commonly portrayed in the media as Elon Musk calls for a ban on killer robots. And that's not what it said at all. Right? The word ban is nowhere in that letter, and Elon Musk, of course, is just one of the signatories. What it was calling for was, it was saying, we are technology companies who have something to contribute to this discussion. We need regulations, right? We need to address the problems these systems can cause. And it was sort of a call for saying, let us be involved in helping to craft those regulations. And so I was very disappointed with much of the media coverage for not acknowledging that. And the sort of takeaway seems to have been like, this letter is over and done with, right? As opposed to it's the saying, let us be involved. They should be part of the process.
I think there's another level of governance in some sense about the connection with the research and development and its societal impact and some of these negative consequences. And certainly that's the researchers themselves governing themselves. So professional societies such as IEEE have started activities to try to help the R&D community itself decide, for instance, what's ethical as it relates to automation, robotics, AI, and that sort of thing. And I think that plays a really important role to help, because R&D scientists are really the ones that probably know the technology strengths and limitations the most, the best. And so certainly having that community self-regulate, understand what the consequences are, is really an important piece that can go on independently of the regulation. And I think it's very interesting, some of the comments that Jack made about dual use and the publication. You could even imagine editorial boards. Certainly they do in other areas, like with CRISPR, they will not publish certain topics or certain areas of research because of the implications of it. And perhaps this community as well needs to start considering more deeply the dual use impacts of some of the research that's published.
Can I just follow up on that, though? Who would decide that? Who would be the body that decides whether or not to
Well,
publish?
professional societies such as IEEE, I'm not trying to put them on the spot, but I am a fellow of IEEE, so I know a little bit about that society. And certainly it's a self-governance thing. It's where the community itself recognizes that this is a challenge and we need to be responsible engineers and scientists in order to address this. Many of the signatories probably on this letter were members of IEEE. So I think it's really the research community getting together itself, recognizing that this is an important challenge, and then trying to come up with solutions within the research community.
I think that this points to a larger level issue that we have in our multilateral framework, at least in the United Nations, where the international security implications of developments in science and technology don't have a home there, right? And member states, they don't have a home in the Secretariat or the existing structures, and member states, i.e. our governments, don't want creation of new mandates, new organizations, new bodies. All of that's very costly. And so we're shoehorning new science and technology issues into existing frameworks, most of which are arms control frameworks, where they're not very comfortable fits. And we're seeing that in cyber, and we've seen that for since the cyber negotiations started in 2004 in the United Nations, and then now on increasing autonomy in weapon systems, which has been put into a very flexible convention. The CCW is very flexible. It has a chapeau, and then you negotiate protocols for specific needs as you go along. But it's the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And we really need to think about this. Is this the fora? Member states have said this is the right fora to discuss AI and increasing autonomy in weapon systems. But there was a steep learning curve, and it's still going on for CCW delegations, not all, but many CCW delegations, for them to understand that this is not a conventional weapon. We're not talking about delivery platforms like drones, right? So if, as a global community, we're concerned about how to develop appropriate regulations at the international level for science and technology applications, we have a lot of thinking to do about what the architecture of that would be, and the role of the private sector in that, because states really want to believe that international security is the domain reservé of the state. And that is just, in some ways, at least in science and technology, no longer the case. Between the research community and the private sector, we must involve them in not just a token way, invite them to come speak at the meeting and then ask them to leave the room when the real negotiations happen. We really have to find new ways of working on these issues together.
It's fascinating. Jack, what do you think about that?
I just want to I agree, but I also want to kind of illustrate this, like AI, it isn't necessarily tied to a specific capital item. It's not like you're going to buy an application-specific integrated circuit, an ASIC, which implements a very specific, very dangerous algorithm. Maybe those are going to be solved, but that's not the only way you're going to be able to avail yourself of that algorithm. Nor are you going to necessarily be able to track for like hardware systems or for software systems that are used. And earlier in the day we saw how students at CMU from Andrew Moore spoke about had in 13 weeks been able to create this kind of smart rock climbing sort of tutor by integrating a bunch of open source technologies which are lying around. And I think that should really challenge our notions of if this could at all fit into traditional arms control frameworks, because the properties are absolutely different. And I think it's so counterintuitive, and I'm basically agreeing vigorously with this point.
That's excellent. Next question?
Ian McLeod from the Applied Physics Lab. And maybe for Jack and Rebecca in particular, but I suppose anyone, are there useful analogies or parallel technology domains that, like this, were very difficult to measure and posed maybe novel challenges to the legal community that you think the government actually got right? And are there lessons from that? Thank you.
I'm going to spin off of that. And so one thing I think is really fascinating about autonomous weapon systems is that the better you get, an analogy, the worse the less law there is in existence. So right now, probably the most apt and common analogy there's just another weapon, right? It's a weapon that you direct, that you use. It might have a certain degree of unpredictability in it, but we can analogize it to a weapon. Works right now, but it's not going to work going forward because it has an X factor, right? It has an element of unpredictability to it, particularly systems that might have emergent capabilities. You're not going to put them through a normal weapons review process. And so as these systems get more and more autonomous, the weapons analogy isn't going to work, and the whole body of law that we've constructed about regulating the acquisition and use of weapons isn't going to apply. The other really common analogy in conversation are that they're combatants. We're going to have robotic soldiers. They're said to be, they're going to be less bloodthirsty or less vengeful or less racist or less bored or tired, and all these different comparators with human soldiers. But that's not a good analogy either, right? Human soldiers can't get turned off and turned back on again. They can't be switched from an autonomous mode to a semi-autonomous mode. They can't be hacked, and they might be spoofed in certain ways, right? But they can't be hacked in the same way. And we control human autonomy through a combination of training on the front end and punishment on the back end. Punishment doesn't work for autonomous systems in the same way, right? So that whole element of using law to constrain action and constrain autonomy doesn't work. So that analogy goes out the window. Other analogies people have used or talked about, one is child soldiers. Children on the battlefield are autonomous actors that can't be held accountable under existing liability regimes for their actions, and we have a ban on them. Problem is we have a ban for a completely different reason than we're talking about a ban on autonomous weapon systems, right? We have a ban to protect the children. No one's interested in a ban on autonomous weapon systems to protect the robotic system. So the law there goes out the window. And then finally, maybe the best analogy is the law of animal combatants, right? Again, autonomous entities on the battlefield that can take action and yet can't really be held accountable, but they can be trained and they can be used in, in teams with human trainers. We have no law of animal combatants. The only thing that's out there is one protocol in the CCCW that says you can't hide booby traps in animal carcasses. So we commonly use law by analogy to try and figure out what the best solution is. The problem is, at least for autonomous weapon systems, we don't have the legal regime.
And I think that for work, Lynn mentioned this with regards to CRISPR, but work done by the scientific communities themselves, not only on CRISPR, but prior to that on things like gain-of-function research, when you look at, dangerous, I'm lapsing on the word, but I think you know what I mean, the creation of, powerful viruses or making a cold worse. I think those are actually good models that we should look to as a community, because there haven't yet been as many really dangerous things that have emerged, partly because the community sort of took hold and said, let's create a social cost to doing things that go against this norm that we're trying to create, and that seemed to be somewhat effective.
Kirsten, I'm just curious, are there any lessons from cyber?
Yes, no. I mean, I see a lot of parallels, obviously, in the cyber discussions. There is no regulation yet, but we're discussing very similar sets of issues. We're discussing how international law applies. We're discussing what are norms of responsible state behavior. How would we recognize norms that are being developed? What norms should we impose, right? What's the role of the private sector in normative development? Another thing that we see in AI. The private sector and the tech community are leading normative development, and states in both cyber and in AI and autonomy are lagging. And what does that mean? Are we going to delegate? Are we going to kind of delegate normative development, to those people out there while we meet 1 week a year or 2 weeks a year to discuss these issues as a community of governments? So there are similarities, but for the moment, they're not happy endings.
If I could just add real quickly on
Sure.
this issue of do we have any good examples of measurement? I think one school of thought says maybe the way to go is not trying to measure directly, but to measure behavior more broadly. So driver's license testing for driver's license is the physical driving test is an example. We don't actually have a really clear quantitative set of measures that says this is what you have to do physically in your car in order to get a license. But you do have a set of tasks, and some human decides you have done that task to some sufficient quality. It's subjective in the mind of the tester. But then you're awarded now a license to drive. And so that's we don't seem to argue about whether or not people can get driver's licenses based on how they're being evaluated in the car. So that's kind of a different way of thinking about evaluating behavior measurement systems.
Interesting. Amir?
Question for Rebecca. So I have some legal law-related questions. The first one is, if you look at AI, what's the current law status of view about the liability, accountability? I mean, autonomous, self-driving cars is one example, but it can be applied to a lot of other things. Who's accountable? And if there's a cyber attack involved, compromise the system, it's just getting more complex. And second is from IP perspective. I'm not talking about the military use, just for the commercial use. So AI right now is really driven by software. Is it copyright, or it's something else that can be applied to IP protection? And I mean, it's just kind of like get your view on this.
So what's the status of the law now? Sort of as I was saying, absent specific laws regulating new technology, you're going to have a fallback to what existing laws are already there. Ryan Calo has a great piece that he just put out where he traced the history of robotics in the American legal system and what happens when robot cases go to court, and found that judges almost inevitably look for a human to blame, right? And not just any human, not just a programmer back or the manufacturer. They tend to focus in on who is the human involved in this specific accident. And this comports well with Madeline Elish's idea that humans run the risk of serving as the moral crumple zone, right? They might stay in the loop or be a supervisor on the loop, and they might exist in that space just to have someone to blame when something goes wrong, just to have someone to hold accountable. That doesn't mean that that individual is necessarily the most appropriate person or entity to be held accountable. But there is at least in American judges, there's been a bias towards holding that person who maybe could have grabbed the steering wheel accountable, focusing on the person who was, say the guy in the Tesla who was, watching a movie and ignoring warnings instead of saying, what was it about the design of the Tesla system that encouraged him to think that he could do so? What was it about the marketing of the autopilot and the language and the analogies used around it to encourage him to maybe think of it as a driverless car as opposed to a highly automated vehicle? And so I think these accountability issues are huge and are going to need to be worked out, hopefully with an awareness that the person in the loop might not be the person actually at fault.
That's great. And on IP protections? I don't know if you're interested in tackling that one.
No.
Okay.
Because I think we're a non-profit, and so it's not something that we directly have to interface with in our day-to-day.
Okay, our next question.
Thank you. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. For Director Vineyard, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you were talking about earlier. You said that the current framework that we have for discussing these things around conventional weapons is like a shoehorn, it's inadequate, and I wonder if you could touch a little bit on what a better framework, to your mind, would look like. And I also am curious, when we talk about conventional weapons and an international dialogue about what they should be about, I've got a sense of all the players, right? And a country that's made a decision to get rid of cluster munitions is in favor of limiting cluster munitions for everybody else. When it comes to these sorts of weapons and their future, I wonder if you just give us a sense of who are the players on a big sense, China, Russia, the United States, what do they seem to want? Is there an agenda emerging that's Chinese, that's Russian, that's American, in terms of what a framework should look like? And I'm not sure if it is yet, but I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks.
what would a better framework look like? That's an excellent question because it goes to the heart of really many challenging questions that go to the UN Charter. You know, territory, sovereignty, the role of the state versus what the state controls and doesn't control. And that, again, we see that in cyber, we see that in autonomy. So I don't have a clear answer of what it would look at. What I do know is that our traditional arms control toolbox, our go-to things of bans, tight regulations, if we're not going to go for an all-out ban, which many people have rightly stated is very impractical for many reasons, at least on the nearer term scales of autonomy, we open up that toolbox. And what do we have in there? We have technology control regimes, export controls. That's our go-to when it comes to these dual-use sensitive technologies. Those aren't going to work this time around. I mean, these are not even dual-use, they're omni-use. They're everywhere. And the governments don't control them. They don't develop them for the most part. They don't own the infrastructure. They don't own the brains that create it. We are in really a brave new world. We open that toolbox and we say, oh, there's nothing there. And that's why I'm saying we need a different community of practitioners around the table to develop appropriate solutions, to put tools back in that toolbox, because I think we need tools in the toolbox, but they're not going to be control regimes. And I think there's a bit of blinders in the traditional arms control community that we'll be able to fit it in there somehow if we just keep on, kind of shoveling it in. And I doubt that that's going to be practical, or the sorts of regulations that we can come up with will be either inadequate or actually harmful, as we saw some criticism, for example, of the Vossner's arrangements on cyber intrusion software. So, we have to be very careful. And all the people sitting in CCW, they certainly have their areas of expertise, don't get me wrong. They're intelligent, thoughtful people, but they don't know everything about everything. So I think we need to bring other smart and thoughtful people to the table to develop appropriate solutions which allow us to get the benefits.
Okay. Next question, anybody? Over here.
There's been a lot of discussion today about international competition and limitations and restrictions. Do you think that's dominating at the expense of discussions about cooperation, and are we missing an opportunity here?
Can I take that? Yes. But to extend it, for a couple of areas where international collaboration is not only kind of needed, but we believe necessary. One is safety. You want a shared toolbox of safety techniques for these AI systems where the incentives inherent to the technology are such that governments of different ideologies will choose to adopt them. So if we get safety right, it means that it will be seen as a way to augment your system, so your system is in some direction more performative, and that by doing so it doesn't hinder you in your international competition with the other players. And I think if we don't get that right, you open yourself to accidents which will be of a scale that are broadly unparalleled, and of a potential for harm that is kind of nightmare-inducing. So yes, I feel quite strongly that collaboration is important.
Can you give an example before you move on? Just can you give an example what you mean by safety? Because it's such a broad term and there's so many different possibilities there.
So what I mean is, the way that I think of it is these systems will take a series of actions that are autonomous over a period of time. That could be a drone, or it could be a large-scale cyber defense system, or it could be something else. And what you want is for those actions to exist within a sort of bounded area of autonomy that you know the limits of. It won't do stuff like this on its own. It will only do stuff that fits within these parameters. And that's when we think about safety, and my colleague Dario spoke earlier about placing humans sort of in the loop of training. It's so that you get that predictability and that surety to some extent. So when we talk about safety, that's really what we mean, and that is somewhat in reference to these reinforcement learning type systems which take actions. It's not quite so relevant for existing systems which classify, and their safety may mean stuff like bias or interpretability, which is also being worked on.
So I think there's a we all know, there's a path dependence to narratives, right? And so I really appreciated the picture of the elephant. The thing is, you could have a lot of people who, without blinders on, looking at that elephant and seeing very different things, right? One weapons procurement person could see a force that would be of great use to ground troops in knocking down a wall. A construction worker could see something that could help him or her move blocks. And what has happened a little bit with the international discussion on autonomy is it's been spurred and has started in the weapons context. And so that's necessarily going to make people think about competition, make people think about relative military advantages. And there hasn't been as much discussion about health standards, right? Or about safety, or about different ways of addressing poverty issues. And so what I would like to see is an opening up of the narrative. I'm glad the conversation has been started. I'm so glad it's happening. I would like to see it open up a lot more. And then I think one thing that international law is actually great at and doesn't get enough credit for is creating standards for cooperation, right? So that we can all these different states and countries can have airlines flying and not hitting each other. I would like to see more of that kind of cooperative law emerge.
Certainly, I think for AI broadly, there are several point examples of cooperative activities. For instance, the UN hosted this AI for Good Global Summit a few months ago, and that brought together governments internationally, academics internationally, and certainly the user community and industry to really have a conversation about how AI can be used for good. It wasn't in the context of security or defense or that sort of thing, but I think it really helped bring these communities together to really understand what the real challenges are. So for the sustainability, development sustainability goals of the UN, things like hunger and education and so forth, these things can lead to improvements in our overall security as well. So I think there are some point examples of collaborative activities. For instance, I know NSF had some conversations with Japan as it relates to smart cities, for instance. So I think there are a lot of these examples of the willingness for folks to collaborate internationally. I don't know that it's led to any sort of broad-scale activity, but I think there's a willingness that's been demonstrated.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned the AI for Good summit that was in June, hosted by the ITU in Geneva. So that was a system-wide UN and as well as private sectors and others. So that's great. And also just to mention that the new Secretary General has a very keen personal interest in what he calls frontier issues, and he's identified, of course, AI as one of the frontier issues. So there's been a kind of a mapping exercise going on right now in the UN by the Chief Executive Board on who's doing what in the UN system on these issues. And then that will help position or make recommendations to the Secretary General of how as a normative body, the United Nations should be showing leadership and more leadership on frontier issues than it's shown in the past. So again, let's kind of watch this space. I think the CB meeting is coming up in the coming weeks, and so November, and I think that we'll see some strong statements coming out from the Secretary General and leadership going forward. So on non-weapons issues.
Interesting. All right, a question here in the back.
To return to the question of dual use, I agree it's an important concept for the community to develop going forward, given the potential for misuse of some of these technologies. But at the same time, I think if the analogy AI is electricity does hold up, I think certainly the notion of omni-use is also quite appropriate in this case, given that you could find military applications for just about any form of AI technology going forward. And certainly the potential for dual use and tech transfer has been provoking a lot of the debates we've seen on CFIUS. I agree that sort of limiting investment based on national origin might be an extreme approach, but at the same time, when China's pursuing a national strategy of military civil fusion that is trying to take advantage of this dual or omni-use capability, and deliberately, as its new AI plan states, trying to take advantage of international innovation resources and a strategy of tech transfer, I think these issues will continue to be problematic going forward. So I'd be curious to hear more thoughts on, are there new metrics or frameworks or ways to think about the risks of technology transfer in the context of AI, perhaps beyond the notion of dual use, given the multiplicity of uses, and options to think about what what sort of ways to think about the risk in a particular case, be it capability or likelihood of misuse or the particular actors involved?
I have one contribution. So I think that the notion of stuff like red teaming would be helpful here, as in take a given technology and have a group of people, ideally partially composed of people from industry who may have even helped develop it, work out all of the ways in which it can be repurposed for, malicious or military uses. And I can imagine developing impact scales and understandings on the basis of that, which can help condition some of what you do. Because as you point out, it is an omni-use thing. And you're going to be playing whack-a-mole if you try and sort of specifically lock down individual parts of it. So it may make sense to think of it as more of this sort of holistic thing where certain things will have a very, very broad scale that goes up to a very, very large scale of impact, and those are where you want to concentrate your efforts. And others may seem like they could be repurposed for some dangerous uses, but they'll be small within some kind of acceptable boundary by the people who come up with this. But it's an open area.
Lynn, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think broadly speaking, we're now in a situation where we've democratized AI to the point that everybody can use it for anything they want to use it. Their creativity is the only bounding factor. So in some sense, omni-use is, I think, a really good term, because it's not that you develop a technology and we have to think about it for a little while to figure out some nefarious use for it. I think it's pretty easy these days to think of these ways of doing it for almost any kind of AI technology that can be used for good, can also be used not for good. Bringing up this UN summit, Global Summit for Good again, I found it extremely valuable because there were people there, say from the Red Cross, that said, on the one hand, as an industry, you might say, well, I just need data, and if I have data, then I can help your refugee crisis. But then the Red Cross will say, the problem is that the data is politicized, and the same despot that can get access to this data can actually harm the refugees with the exact same data. So you could do good with it, you can do bad with it. And it's very difficult to even imagine for any of these technologies that we could say, okay, this one, it's okay because I can't imagine how to use it in a bad way. So I think we're in a whole new era now with this technology. In some sense, we've really opened up Pandora's box, that we've created technologies that can go either way. And as a researcher, you might say, well, maybe we can invest in more R&D for inherently safe AI systems. And certainly it's not an area that's been deeply explored, and I think there's certainly, it's important to study those sorts of things. There are no clear and obvious answers to me.
I think we have time for at least one more question. Right here in the front.
Hi, thanks. Carl Robichaud, Carnegie Corporation of New York. Countries are developing their own policies on each of these questions, but they're also looking to their neighbors and their potential adversaries. So in some ways, we have a real collective action problem. And I was wondering if you've seen any cases where there's a potential race to the bottom and how we might prevent that, and whether there are any steps countries can take to be more transparent about their intentions.
Race to the bottom. Anyone? Rebecca?
It goes to me for the bad stuff. Well, I'll start with the good stuff. So the US DoD published its policy on autonomous weapon systems, right? And this publication coincided with Human Rights Watch's report, which really presented two different views on this new technology in a way that sparked a conversation. And because the report was out there, it could be celebrated, it could be criticized, but it's an example of a government publishing its thoughts and its policy and its approach, and perhaps for governments that hadn't thought to even do that, it provided something against which other governments could say, what do we want to do? And if the US is doing this, maybe we should be thinking about it too. It gave the issue a legitimacy that it hadn't had before. Right? Like, too often, if I talked about being interested in autonomous weapon systems, people scoffed and were like, oh, so you really like Terminator, right? Like, as opposed to something legitimate that governments were concerned about. So simply the act of making public policies can go a really long way.
Yeah.
I think that we're yet to see the emergence of international kind of data marketplaces, but I think that it's fairly likely these will happen. Most governments have access to some forms of data which are inherently useful or useful for AI. And you can imagine them setting up systems where you can exchange data with other governments if you fulfill some kind of norm set collaboratively. And in this way, you can create more of a kind of carrot as well as presumably having a big stick somewhere as well to help with that.
I mean, just on the race to the bottom issue, we heard during the discussions today that there was concerns that, different governments don't know what their AI systems can do yet, right? They don't really know where we're at, and there's obviously competitions that DARPA and others fund that helps get us a sense of the private sector and researchers. Is that a potential race to the bottom issue that we'll see different governments, in the dark about each other's capabilities, and then if there were ever a kind of a conflict, you'd have an unknown scenario. No one? Is there any concern about the lack of sharing or the lack of transparency?
I mean, yes, I don't have a good, simple answer for it, though, so it's just another thing which makes me slightly nervous.
Yep.
Certainly in the CCW framework, there's been discussions about the strategic stability aspects of this and the fact that there are so few policies that are out there and public. We don't know what the intentions are, and that's destabilizing. And it's only going to get more destabilizing as the technologies, we all see the technology progressing, but we don't see the openness about the policies developing. They always develop, behind. But if that lag gets too great, it's going to be very destabilizing. So again, there should be more, that should motivate us. And the US comes under a lot of criticism for its policy, but I mean, good on them for putting it out, right? I mean, I look to that and I don't agree with a lot of it, but I say it's there and it's something that I can react to, and I encourage all governments to do the same thing. So yeah, it's good to have that. That's gonna help us. It is.
All right, we'll finish on a positive note. Thanks very much.
Speaker today is Dr. Missy Cummings, Director of the Humans and Autonomy Lab at Duke University. Missy is also a former Navy fighter pilot, so she has a unique and valuable perspective on human automation teaming in military systems. Please welcome Dr. Cummings.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, I am quite aware that I'm standing in between you and the booze. So I'm going to try to make this quick and enjoyable, and hopefully we'll have time left for some questions. So I picked this title because, first of all, I just wanted to recognize who else is a big Clint Eastwood fan. Because if you're a Clint Eastwood fan, it also means you get the joke behind the name of my laboratory. If you don't get it, you have to ask somebody over 40 what that means. So I'm going to take on a little professorial air here and lecture you a little bit about what is automation, what is artificial intelligence, what is autonomy. And I speak to this in this rubric that I call the SRKE framework, the Skills, Rules, Knowledge, and Expertise framework. This stems out of some earlier research from Jens Rasmussen from the Netherlands, where we're focusing on what behaviors, what reasoning events need to occur for any agent to navigate through any world. And this could be a human or it could be automation. And so because I was a former fighter pilot, like you heard, I like to put it in the context of flying. And so in the first picture you see next to skills, what this is showing you is that for a person to fly an airplane, the very first thing they must learn to do is keep the aircraft in balanced flight. They need to make sure that they learn what altitude is, heading, how to control the speed and the throttle. And you actually spend about a good year just learning to keep the plane in balanced flight. That is a skill. Once you do it enough, it becomes highly automatic. You don't really have to think about it again. Most pilots can go from one aircraft to another and keep the plane in balanced flight. maybe it's not pretty, maybe you need just a little bit of a learning curve, but you get it. You understand how to do this. Once you've actually freed up enough cognitive resources beyond the skills that you've learned, then you can start to learn how to apply rules in your world. And we consider these procedures. When an engine fire light goes off, we understand there's a set of procedures. I don't necessarily have to commit all of them to memory. I have to commit just about 2 or 3 to memory. And then I break out the book, and then I follow along in the book. So once I freed up enough cognitive resources and I really understand how to quickly get through my book and my procedures, then I have enough cognitive resources to devote to knowledge-based events. And you're starting to see you're going up this big arrow. And as you're going up the arrow, what that means is uncertainty is also increasing. And so as uncertainty grows in your world, you have to start applying these higher levels of reasoning because you have to start making guesses, you or automation or AI. So at knowledge-based reasoning, there's no clear procedure. Something has happened. There might be an element of one procedure that applies and another procedure applies, but it's not clear. There's no rule book. And you have to start making some guesses. And I like to quote The Miracle on the Hudson for this one, because Chesley Sullenberger had to make a guess. Dual engine flame out. He knows what to do when there's an engine flame out. He actually knew what to do with both engines immediately, but then where to land. Lots of guesswork involved, not clear that he was going to make it back to the airfield, so he decided to ditch the aircraft. So, and it is because of that, is because he had to deal with the most uncertainty that a pilot would have to face, he actually then gains expertise. And so I know many pilots who have the same number of hours that he has, about 20,000+, close to 30,000, but they're not as much of an expert as he is because he had to deal with the maximal uncertainty that required his expert judgment, and he didn't really even know what to do until he did it. And so if we start to think about where automation is in our everyday life, we have autopilots. Autopilots are excellent. There is a reason that commercial airline pilots only touch the stick about 3 minutes of every flight. Why? Because as long as the automation is flying the plane, there's a substantial savings in gas. So the airlines save a ton of money, the carbon footprint goes down, and it's not just in the fuel economy. If the automation lands the planes, then that saves the tires, and their tire bill, the airline's tire bill goes way down. These are all skills. Why can we automate the skills? Because we've got really excellent sensors, very mature systems, 10 to the -9th, that give us the reliability that we need to keep that plane moving in balanced flight. We go up to scale a little bit, we've also got auto-nav. Auto-nav is pretty good, which are a set of rules. And we can do that because we've got really good maps, we can sense the world around us in aviation very clearly. And then that's about where we see the limits of automation today. And that's where automation then stops when we have very clear sensing and a very clear rule book. Once you start to tip past that point, now you're starting to increase the degrees of autonomy that you need, because you can think of autonomy as a sense of guessing. How am I going to guess to manage the uncertainty in the world around me? Now, I do a lot of work on killer robots. You know, we could get into the argument about what killer robots are. I do think Elon Musk is hilarious for trying to come out against artificial intelligence in killer robots, when in fact the only robot that's ever actually killed anyone is his Tesla, with any sense of autonomy on it. Oh, don't get me started. Now, if we want to start thinking about weapon systems, so you could think about AAA, anti-aircraft artillery. That's kind of a skill-based weapon that we have. It's just got a very simple radar, actually. It tracks aircraft, and it just keeps a nice close feedback loop that we teach in basic controls engineering in college. So really not a lot of rules going on, even just some basic tracking and shooting, track, shoot, track, shoot. But then you go up a little bit, and this is a picture of an AMRAAM. AMRAAMs are radar-guided missiles. And my flight instructor once told me, he said, they're like wild dogs in a meat locker. You put that thing on it, and you make sure it gets its fire control radar in, that you support a little bit from your plane until it gets close enough, and then it'll go for it, right? But it's going for it not because it has any smarts, but basically because it's following a prescribed set of rules that have been coded. They're actually really simple systems. They're not as advanced as these weapons are and as expensive as they are, and I hope there's no weapons manufacturers in there. They're really simple aircraft from a logical standpoint, weapons from a logical standpoint. So most weapons you see in today are at the rule and below. But we start to bridge that gap a little bit with the Tomahawk. And in fact, this is what I think is so interesting about the Tomahawk weapon. It is actually a relatively old weapon that we've had for a long time, but it actually has the most advanced smarts of any weapon that we see today in an inventory that we use on a regular basis. Why? That's because it has digital scene mapping inside of its brain, and it takes a picture of the world around it when it's doing its low altitude contour following, and it takes the picture that it has in its brain, and it matches against the picture it sees in the world, and when it matches, it knows where it is. That is actually very much in line with how pattern recognition for driverless cars is working today. We're matching the scenes around us, right? So not really advanced autonomy, but certainly a first step. And so when we start to talk about banning AI, this is something I teach. I work every day in AI. I cannot tell you, I am a little worried I would never drive in a driverless car that any of my students built, ever, because it's a very difficult topic. But, we are still not quite to the place where we're embedding true autonomy, even in, I would say, experimental weapons, and this is why you see me go over to the Atlas robot. So the Atlas robot is a really good robot right now at the skill level. But even still, it struggles to maintain balance, and Boston Dynamics has done a really good job. It's something that they're working on, but they're working primarily still very much at the skill, possibly a little bit of the rule. What would that robot have to do to go all the way to knowledge-based reasoning? It would be able to have language, to conduct language, to have conversations with significant background noise, to be able to have sensors that could operate in all scenarios under all weather conditions. These are still issues that we're really struggling with in research labs around the world, and so we are nowhere near at this point in time doing a slide all the way over to full autonomy. But when we start to think about trying to ban AI, even though the technology is not there, I think it's important to remember what people really need to think about when they want to ban a weapon is, are they trying to ban a technology because of its capability or incapability, or are they trying to ban a particular outcome? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to show you a few real-world issues about just how well autonomous systems are handling uncertainty in the world today. So this is a picture from Toyota Research Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I work with them every now and then, Gil Pratt, John Leonard, really great guys. And they gave me this picture so that I could communicate to you just where we are in thinking about autonomy for driverless cars. And I know you're like, well, you were talking about weapons, but why are we talking about driverless cars now? Because, in fact, these two areas are going to be more and more difficult to untangle as time goes on. But I would tell you right now, in terms of computer vision, driverless cars are more advanced than most military systems you'll see. So let's start here. Very, very advanced. Toyota driverless car gets to an intersection in Cambridge. Is everybody watching? You got to pay attention. It's going to come fast. This is what the driver, who is the babysitter of the automation, sees. This is what the automation sees. This is how the car interprets the world. Okay, let's go back. Everybody ready? Let's go back just so you see it. The real world, you ready? The computer's vision of the world. And so your ability to reason under uncertainty and to take all the little individual bits and pieces told your brain through inductive reasoning that you just see a truck going through an intersection. What does the car see? The car sees a gigantic human about to attack it, 2 trucks, a bus, a fence, a bunch of poles, and a traffic sign, right? So And I have to tell you, this is about as advanced as it gets right now. And so how does that happen? It happens because this is a data-driven world. The cars are taking every bit of data. They're trying to make a guess about what the world is, but we haven't figured out yet, and I still put that as a yet, how to enable inductive reasoning in machines, because right now this is a very data-driven, bottoms-up set of reasons that it's trying to come to. All right. This is why you really, this keeps me awake at night. Real quick, I heard that you heard about this, right? You saw this earlier today. So, and I heard you got a little bit of a lecture, which is good, about how artificial intelligence, these pattern recognition algorithms, if you took those crazy Berkeley glasses and put some clever patterns on them, that you can trick an algorithm, if you know how the algorithm works, to see something it doesn't see. Guess where that's coming to you, to a set of Russian hackers near you next. So a couple of people related to that trial also went to, did a separate study to show what would it take to trick a driverless car and see a sign that it didn't really see. So these 4 stickers, black and white stickers, put on a stop sign, made it see that sign as 45 miles per hour. So you could imagine, and this is, I call this passive hacking. So I would have never, none of us would have ever noticed really those squares on that sign. We all would have driven right by that sign and thought, graffiti, the DOT is not doing its job. And if a driverless car had seen this unattended, it would run that stop sign, right? And yes, it's in a research lab, academic lab right now, and yes, you have to have some smarts. Your average hacker is not going to be able to do this today, but I'm only half kidding when I say the academic trick today is your average Russian hacker's toolbox tomorrow. It is only a matter of time before this propagates in a way that you'll start seeing this, not just in the military, not just at face recognition, but in the way that these computer vision cameras see the world. And what is kind of alarming about the driverless car world is the driverless car community is going to get to production and to massive implementation of these technologies on a much bigger scale than the military could have ever hoped to achieve. And because of that, we're going to start seeing access to the technology by groups of people, by regular hackers that you would never guess. Now, it's not all bad news. You're like, let's get to the bar sooner than later so we can start drinking. I did want to tell you that there are really positive things to think about where AI is. I actually put the slides together, John, before I knew you were going to be here. So this is John Langford's baby. This is the Alias program, and it was a project that Aurora Flight Sciences, soon to be Boeing, they were the lead PIs, and I was just one of their mere subcontractors on it. But you effectively can think of this Alias project as an R2-D2 of the future. Those of you who are Star Wars fans, R2-D2 was Luke Skywalker's or Pilot X's co-pilot that would sit in the back. So I think we did try to start with R2-D2, and we got called out on it by Lucasfilms, and we had to change the name to R2-A2 because we're clever. And so this is a robot arm that acts just like R2-D2, or at least the closest approximation that we have. The robot can respond to voice commands. It's not sexy. It doesn't have a cool little personality yet like R2-D2, but if you ultimately tell it that you want to go to the back while you go get a cup of coffee, and so can it take the plane, it can do that. It can actuate switches. It can understand what you are doing. And this is still in the early days of Alias, but this kind of collaboration is, to me, where I see the greatest strength of AI in the future. Not that we try to replace humans, but we try to figure out how to augment humans, and so that we can take some of those skills and rules that are taking so much of our cognitive resources to apply in our daily world to free us up to actually use the knowledge and the expertise, which is where humans bring the most judgment and the most value. Humans, in this way, by combining the two, letting the automation / autonomy / AI do your grunt work and let the humans be the quarterback, the coach, this is going to be the real strength of the future. That's my favorite picture of a flying car. Flying cars, probably one of the funnest yet craziest projects I'm working on right now at NASA. Also, John is in this space, so he can regale you with tales of what it's like to be trying to move into the future really fast. So flying cars are the quintessential combination of the driverless AI problem and taking the flight AI problem and combining them all together. So don't hold your breath. You're not going to pull out your iPad or your iPhone anytime soon and call the driverless car to come and pick you up and then whisk you off. We're still quite a ways away from that. I would actually tell you really more for regulatory reasons than anything else. But why does it matter in terms of this conversation? It matters because there is so much tech hype out there right now. I'm going to Dubai in a week, so hopefully we're going to see some flying car action happening out there. Dubai is taking this very seriously. They've got Volocopter out there, they've got eHang out there, and they are trying really hard to start a flying car service. Well, that's great, and we're still pretty far away from it. But I think what is really, truly amazing about this technology that is coming way faster than I ever thought it would come is, it's that same issue with what is going on in the civilian world versus the defense world. It is very likely that civilians will have driverless cars and that technology well before military people ever will. And so what is that going to mean when Marines go in and take a city and they've got to contend with civilians fleeing in a flying car, or that ISIS or some other agency figures out how to hack into a flying car that maybe could have civilians and maybe not could have civilians. And so what's interesting to me about where we are in time is that the development is happening so fast in the civilian world and is so rapidly outpacing what the United States military is capable of, and likely other militaries are capable of. It really makes you wonder then what's going to happen to the military and where are we at in losing our cutting edge. And so let me just show you one last picture to give you an idea of where we sit now in terms of funding. And so what you see is you see these different industries: aerospace and defense, automotive, information and communication, which are the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, and the energy sectors. And what you're seeing are the money that the U.S. has spent basically in the last 3 years versus what's happening in the rest of the world. And I heard the last panel, so you already heard a little bit about how China was jumping ahead. But what is this really telling you? First of all, it's telling you that the driverless car world right now, in terms of R&D, is outspending the U.S. defense R&D by 3 to 1. Facebook and Google are outspending them by 10 to 1. And in fact, it's not even clear where driverless cars, are they in the 10 to 1, are they in the 3 to 1? They're actually in both of those R&D fields. But either way, they're grossly outspending what is happening in the United States in terms of our R&D funding. Why does that matter? It matters because every day I am impacted by the draw of the sirens on the island of Scilly Valley, pulling all of my people out there. I know John, his company feels it. We feel it. I just lost my best research scientist 2 days ago to a driverless car company. I'm going to be honest with you. Paul may want to ask me in a year to do this, and I'm going to be out of academia. I mean, there is so much money. They are recruiting, they being IT companies, the Googles, the Facebooks. Students are getting recruited before they graduate with their undergraduate degrees if they're superstar coders. This is not a game, and it's not a funny little anecdote that we're telling anymore. We can't get robotics professors. All universities, if you were to go to the job board and find out robotics professors opening at every single school, we just can't get enough. We're all overworked. It is enviable to be a research professor, to have all the money that we have and have all the projects that we have, but it's not sustainable. We can't do it. So we as a country need to figure out, how are we going to address this? There is a massive brain drain, and it's not just in the U.S. China is coming on strong. Most university engineering schools look Chinese and Indian, and I will tell you want to be controversial, they are better students. They work harder, they put the hours in, they are hungry for it. They want to be top roboticists. My Indian students and my Chinese students run circles around most of my American students. And so when we've got such a gap growing in this country, how we're going to fill the education gap, how we're going to pump enough people out, how we're going to introduce coding at every single stage in education. I mean, this is a battle that needs to be fought by universities, but it also has to be fought by companies, think tanks, government agencies, because we need that demand to come from on high, because as much as bureaucratic as you think the government is, the universities are ridiculously slow to change, but they will change as long as they're getting influence from the right people outside of the university. I'm sorry I ran a little bit over. Well, hopefully we have some time for questions. I think I'm getting the hook. Thank you.
Missy will be at the reception. All right, you can try to track her down there for questions. We want to wrap on time. I have loads of people to thank. Thank you to all of our speakers for their wonderful insights. It's been a great day. I want to thank our event sponsors, Spark Cognition, Morgan Stanley, Unisys, and CSRA. I want to thank all of you for your participation. We've had a great team here at CNAS behind all of this. I want to recognize some of these folks. Tristan Campos, our designer, was behind all of these beautiful designs that you see here. Jasmine Butler, our event coordinator, made all of these things possible. Jasmine, wave your hand. Thank you. Claire Pritchard, Claire, please raise your hand. Made all of this happen, and particularly getting all of our speakers here, making sure that they were here on time and ready to present. I want to thank Anthony Cho, Aline Bryant, Melody Cook, Cecilia Zhao, Neil Urwitz, and our awesome CNS intern team in the back row there who've made all these things happen. This summit was the first in a multi-year research effort here at CNAS to look at artificial intelligence and global security. We have a lot more things coming. I hope you'll please stay engaged with us. We have a major report on this topic coming out in 2018. You can follow some of our research and sign up on our mailing list at cnas.org/AI. And this concludes our event. We have a reception afterwards, right out here from 4 to 5. We also have, if anyone's interested, tickets to the museum. If you want to grab one, please see Jessica there in the back, waving her hand. And I hope you'll stay afterwards for a little bit and continue the conversation. Thank you.